411 Confidence by Heidesgrain. When Heifer had perceived Jason's aura, she was already suspicious about him, but seeing the stigma that glowed faintly, she could hardly contain herself. Foreign races were able to determine that he was not a pure human right off the bat, but that was different for humans. They had never seen the unleashed aura from someone of the Celestia race and a stigma of a foreign race in their entire life. As Jason heard that Heifer asked him if he had a trait without showing any signs of noticing that something was, he was sure that he was not in danger. This didn't mean that Heifer wouldn't kill, attack, or do anything like that to him, which was still an existing possibility, but more thanks to the fact that even an old one was unable to tell whether he was a halfling from a foreign race or a human with a unique trait. However, there was only one problem with the latter point. If Jason had to count his visible, unique traits, there were 3 in total. His Celestia aura, the stigma that glowed faintly, and his gold and silver shining eyes. If he had only one of those traits, everything would be fine, maybe even 2 out of those 3 would be fine, but Jason had yet to hear from a human with 3 advantageous, foreign traits. There were already prodigies with 2 strong traits, but those traits were very different too and not like Jason's. As such, he could only smile lightly when Heifer had asked if he had a trait. He trusted his masters and took a deep breath before he said, "I'm sorry for my earlier rude behavior when Muz and my master were talking about. My name is Jason Stella and I'm a human with the blood from a foreign race flowing through me." Bowing lightly, he showed Heifer that he didn't harbor any ill intentions, but Jason also expected to be eyed disgustingly or maybe even cursed at, when he heard a deep sigh from the middle-aged woman with red hair. "That's your surprise, Shane. How is someone like that called? Human mixling. Mutant. Halfling. Probably halfling, right?" Heifer seemed to take this news relatively lightly, only for Jason to perceive that her eyes seemed to be a little bit distracted. "I prefer being called by my name, Jason. That should be feasible, right? It's not like I was able to choose to be born as a halfling. Furthermore, I have never spoken to my father in person. To be honest, it hasn't been that long since I found out what exactly I am, and I would be thankful if I can be treated like you would treat any human, if that's possible." Jason was unsure how he should talk to someone he had never met before while knowing that she knew of his biggest secret. At least he would call it like that. There was nothing he wanted to hide as much as the fact that he was a halfling. That might originate from the fact that humans and all foreign races he had encountered and heard from were hostile to each other. As such, it couldn't be a great opening to reveal his true identity right after he got to know someone new. Right now, the situation was a little bit different, but that was because he trusted Shane. He had told Jason that everything would be okay, and that was exactly what was going on. There was no problem with his revelation, and it took Heifer less than a minute before she got the hang of herself once again. She wanted to ask Jason lots of questions, but before Heifer could do so, she noticed how uncomfortable Jason was. As such, she averted her attention to Shane as she asked, "So you want to forge a soul weapon for this youngster here? If he has the blood of a foreign race within him, his physical strength and mana sensitivity should be much higher. That's already good, but how about his affinities and soul world? Wait. Does he even have a soul world?" It was impossible to overlook that she was extremely interested in Jason, who had noticed that she avoided asking him questions when she saw how uncomfortable he was in the situation he was currently in. After he saw this, he could only slap his cheeks, which was heard through the whole small shop, attracting everyone's attention. Taking a deep breath, he calmed down before he couldn't help but smile dryly as he said, "I'm ready to answer your questions, thanks for being so considerate." Heifer didn't expect Jason to be so polite, which was rare to see amongst prodigies, to which the young black-haired youth definitely belonged. She was unsure how old he was, but she doubted that he had passed the age of 18 years. Suddenly Dahlia pointed at Jason's hair as she said, "Jason. You have gray, no, 2 silver strands in your hair. When Jason heard this, he felt weird for a moment. However, he didn't panic as Shane or the others had expected. Rather than that, he turned towards one of the shelves where all kinds of antiquity were placed inside. Some of them were shining brightly and he was able to see his mirrored appearance within the unknown, metallic objects. Oh! There really are some silver-colored strands. At least this change won't make anyone more suspicious about my heritage. Smiling lightly, he turned back to the others that stared at him weirdly as he smiled. It's not like my looks are disfigured because of a few silver-colored strands in my black hair, right? Scratching the back of his head, he turned to Shane as he asked. Was my blacksmith practice with the purification of grade 3 ores because of the soul weapon you want to forge? Now that my bloodline has awakened, I should be able to purify almost all grade 3 ores perfectly. That is if both Solaris and I won't be pressured by time. He had already been confident in himself, but now that he awakened the Celestia bloodline, everything about himself had been augmented to a previously unimaginable degree. It wouldn't even wonder Jason if Solaris' abilities had been strengthened by the stigma it had engraved on its mana core. However, when Heifer heard what Jason said, she could help but eye Jason and Shane weirdly. Shane didn't seem to say anything and just nodded his head, to which Jason remained silent, and it looked like they had a silent agreement about what Jason had said before. Because Heifer couldn't understand why Shane allowed a youngster to reduce superior grade 3 ores, which was even more difficult to forge with than peak grade 3 ores, to ingots, even less purify them, she had to voice out her concerns. I should have a few kilograms of Evaldronite and a Fenrir ore left, but it should be barely enough to forge 2 longswords, at most. It's clear what I want to say, right? There will only be 2 tries for both, and these ores are extremely sensitive to the surrounding heat and mana. 2 mistakes and everything will be for naught. Not even I can confidently say that I'm able to purify them more than halfway through, let alone perfectly purify them. Why are you so confident? It was obvious why she was so confused. According to the news she heard, her blacksmithing capabilities were the best within mankind, and she had already forged many grade 4 weapons. Yet, she was not confident in perfectly purifying Evaldronite or a Fenrir ore. At least not if she had only 2 attempts. If it were a dozen, Heifer would be confident to find one good ore, whose complex mana veins didn't overlap, hindering impurities from being expelled. However, even if she would find a perfect ore, she would rather stop after purifying either of those ores at 70% because it was too risky. Yet, Shane only gazed at Jason, who shrugged his shoulders. Solaris' control over its flame and the accuracy of maintaining the flame's temperature should be perfect as long as it doesn't go above 4000 degrees Celsius. I don't think we have to talk about my eyes, right? The only thing I have to pay attention to is that the impurities won't touch or even injure the mana veins. My control over mana is much higher than before, but I'm not sure to what extent it has increased. If I can't even purify those grade 3 ores with my mana eyes, an origin flame, and my mana perception, I might as well stop comparing myself to other foreign races. 2 attempts. Give me one and I'll show you what I'm capable of after undergoing the primal awakening of the Celestia bloodline. Chapter 412 Unknown, Mysterious Race by Hydesgrain. Shane had the same opinion as Jason. He had already been able to purify a common grade 3 ore, to some extent after Solaris, the Black Origin Flame had evolved. As such, now that his mana eyes, mana perception and control received a substantial increase in their capabilities, Jason should be able to purify Evaldronite and a Fenrir ore. Adding the fact that Jason and his soul bonds obtained a stigma through the primal Celestia bloodline awakening, which enhanced every aspect that had to do with mana. With that being said, Shane would be disappointed in his disciple if he were to fail. It sounded ridiculous after thinking about it, but Shane couldn't see Jason as a youth anymore. Jason's blacksmith capabilities were already higher than his own, and he had learned how to forge for more than 200 years, while his disciple had just started. Shane was extremely envious about almost everything Jason had, whether it was his talent, his eyes, or his magnificent soul. However, instead of loathing his disciple because of that, Shane gave his best to help Jason to become stronger. The dangers humanity had to face in the next few years would be numerous and chaotic, but Shane was confident that Jason played an important, if not the most important role to solve everything. Yet, in order to face those who were stronger than Jason, he would have to be stronger. Shane couldn't help much to improve Jason's mana absorption, and he was unable to support him in many other things. There was only one exception. He should forge one of the strongest, if not the most powerful weapon ever made by humans for Jason. This would increase his combat prowess drastically. Adding that Shane wanted to forge a soul weapon for Jason, it would grow with his disciple's increase of strength and maybe even exceed its limits. Under normal circumstances, soul weapons were bound to their material limitations, but that was not the case with all of them. There were a few exceptions, and Shane wanted to apply all of them at once. If the materials used were perfectly refined, a material would receive a huge, qualitative leap in its characteristics. Meanwhile, if one's soul was integrated into the whole forging process, from the beginning to the end, the soul weapon would adjust itself perfectly to the wielder. Other than that, there had also been the possibility that nurturing a soul weapon, armor, accessory might create a mutation, forcefully increasing the weapon's quality and material limit by a small margin. For the latter part, the first case about perfectly refined materials had to apply too. As such, it was important to purify the used ores perfectly. Adding the Mayrid soul wood that was considered the strongest, yet very dangerous material to produce a soul weapon with, Shane was confident that Jason would receive a huge increase in his combat prowess. That was if everything worked according to the plan he had in mind since the big clan gathering had been announced. Every kingdom was filled with war, and one could say that the Chandra country that was governed by the Shiabi clan was the most peaceful right now. There were only a few other big clans that were able to hold up against the onslaught of foreign races. However, this was because there was an unknown race supporting the Shiabi clan. Shane hadn't heard anything about that race, and neither had anyone else, except those who belonged to the Shiabi clan. Everyone remained silent, and nobody knew how many individuals from the unknown foreign race resided within the Chandra country or what the true plan was. The only certain fact was that Chandra country's citizens were safe, and Shane was sure that this had something to do with the unknown race and the fact that the Shiabi clan was in contact with them. Nevertheless, Shane and Dahlia felt that the situation within the Chandra country was completely different from every other country, and it was like the mysterious foreign race was genuinely helping the Shiabi clan. If that was truly the case, there had to be something important the Shiabi clan possessed which nobody knew about. Furthermore, it shouldn't have anything to do with human trafficking or something similar to that. This was important because Shane and Dahlia had carefully thought about every single step they were taking. It was already a difficult decision to decide which country on Kanya they should visit, stay, or even support once forging the soul weapon was done. In the end, there were multiple big clans Shane wanted to support because they had been good to him when he was pursued by the alliance of other big clans. However, he was uncertain whether they were still like before or if something about them had changed. There were too many unknown factors about the soul contracts some big clans had formed with the foreign races, and it wouldn't be surprising if some clans had been forced to wage war against other races. As such, the Chandra country seemed to be the most reliable one right now, and Shane felt like supporting the Shiabi clan that had already received support from a mysterious race might be the best way. The Shiabi clan had defended Shane and even tried to protect him to a certain degree, at the time he had been pursued. One could say that many facts pointed towards helping the Shiabi clan, but on the other hand, there could always be ill intentions behind goodwill. Turning to Heifer, Shane couldn't help but shrug his shoulders as he said, "You've heard Jason. If he is confident, why shouldn't he try it? I won't be able to purify it perfectly, but that doesn't mean he is unable to purify them." Jason smiled, inwardly, thanking his master's trust as he thought, in the end, these materials are just goods mankind was able to procure. That means they're already limited in their capabilities from the get-go. There might be ores and materials we call grade 3 and grade 4, but I doubt that there's something special to foreign races. It might be enough to forge a great weapon for someone at the Prisma stage, but that should already be it. When Heifer saw how confident both Shane and Jason were while Dahlia was more interested in the surrounding antiquaries, she couldn't help but feel that something was going wrong. Looking at the only normal member of their small group, Heifer stared at Emily, who was not sure how difficult Shane and Jason's plan really was. She had already concocted grade 1 potions, but according to what Dahlia, her master, had said, concocting and blacksmithing are somewhat different. Something like soul potions didn't exist. Because of that, Emily was unable to understand how difficult it would be to forge a soul grade 3 weapon. From her knowledge, she could understand how difficult creating grade 1 goods was in comparison to grade 3 goods, but that was already it. Thus she remained silent and didn't say anything while listening carefully. Heifer had to look between every member of the small group that was consistent of 4 members only to sigh deeply. Alright, it's not like I'll lose anything if I sell you the Mayrid Soulwood, Evaldronite and a Fenrir ore, but I have a condition. If you want to purchase those 3 items, I want an explanation of what a primal awakening really is and everything included. It might as well be easier to summarize your life, because I don't get how someone like you, Jason, was unheard of before. Chapter 413 Tricky Deal by Hydesgrain. Shane had already expected that there would be an additional condition if they were to purchase all 3 materials, so he was not surprised. They were extremely rare and procuring them had probably taken several decades. The reason for this was because both ores were extremely rare and their occurrences were small. Furthermore, the location at which they could be found was a particular, high-ranked rift. Those rifts were extremely dangerous, with several monarch-ranked beasts roaming around too. Meanwhile, the ore occurrences were protected by even stronger beasts. This means that acquiring a few kilograms of Evaldronite and a Fenrir ore was already a difficult task. At the same time, acquiring Mayrid Soulwood might seem somewhat easier, but the beasts protecting the Mayrid Soul trees were strong too. However, they didn't attack someone at a physical level but their opponent's mind and soul. As such, Shane was glad that the condition Heifer had stated was something so simple. In the past, her demands were extremely high, and most big clans or old ones did only reluctantly visit her to purchase something when they were truly desperate. Looking at Jason, Shane could only say that it was his decision, whether or not he would tell Heifer his story. After he had thought about it, Jason decided that Heifer had already found out most of his secrets, like him being a halfling from the Celestia race, that he had mana eyes, or that he possessed an origin flame. The latter was something she had found out when Jason had spoken to Shane, thus he thought that he might as well reveal everything if they received enough benefits from it. Until now, Heifer had remained calm about everything she had heard and seen during the last few minutes, which told Jason that she was either thinking about something or that she didn't mind that he was not entirely from the human race. In the end, this didn't matter, because everything he had heard during the last few minutes pointed towards the fact that the soul weapon Shane wanted to forge him would be extremely powerful. Yet, to create this powerful soul weapon, they required the 3 ingredients Shane had previously stated. As such, Jason started to summarize his own story, without telling too much or too little information. He didn't explicitly say that he had encountered his father or every detail about his mana eyes, but the sheer mass of uncommon things that had happened to Jason was already enough for Heifer to say, "Are you sure that you're not an old one?" There were too many things that had happened to Jason in such a short time, but if she were to be honest, the most shocking was Jason's current age, his soul world, and the fact that his combat prowess might be on par with the Grandmagus. After she had heard everything, Heifer took some time to digest everything, which included the fact that foreign races used body refining techniques, that there was an unimaginable high number of planets that were more advanced than Argos, and that their cultivation system was not a little bit wrong, but completely. A few minutes had passed and Heifer had remained at the exact same position, before she turned around, moved to the counter, as she took out a peculiar spatial ring. Inserting her mana into the spatial ring, large ore lumps in 2 different colors and a black-colored piece of wood landed on the counter as she said, "Thanks for telling me your story, Jason. Shane, you'll cover the bill, right? You know that my payment is different from others, right?" Jason didn't listen to Heifer and instead stared at the ore lumps and the piece of wood. Evaldronite ore was black in color while the Afinir ore was silverish in color with faint strands of the rainbow colors intertwined within. She smiled at Shane lightly before she showed him a number, 10, which caused Shane to explain. 10. You want 10. Jason was not sure what that meant, but when Dahlia heard how Shane explained, she had to say, 10 unconditional favors are a lot. After he had heard Dahlia, Jason began to understand that Heifer's payment would be unconditional favors, instead of star notes. This was nothing surprising because the price for the 3 materials that stood on the counter should be extremely high if Jason didn't misunderstand everything. 3 favors for each ore and 4 for the Mayrid Soul wood. Heifer said with a faint smile on her lips. She knew how important those items were for Shane, and at the same time, she felt that Dahlia and Jason wanted to obtain them too. It was obvious because strong weapons were sometimes enough to let someone survive dangerous circumstances, which was even more important in the current times they would have to face. In the end, it was not even sure if everyone survived the war which the foreign races and a few big clans had initiated, but that was also the reason Heifer wanted to make use of everything she could. She is a true businesswoman. Jason thought inwardly, thinking that she didn't give her friends any discounts while knowing how important the 3 ingredients were to Shane and everyone else. Suddenly he recalled how Heifer had said that the ores she had were enough for 2 attempts of a perfect refinement. As such he subconsciously blurted out, "If I perfectly refine all the ores and we return what's not required, we shouldn't have to pay much, right? At least not if you're not confident to perfectly refine the Evaldronite and Afinir ore as you said." Shane hadn't thought that this was feasible because he didn't want Jason to exhaust himself too much during the purification process. He would have to insert a thread of his soul during the entire purification process of the ores to receive the best outcome during the following process after all. In the end, everything was slightly more difficult than Jason might expect and Shane was not sure whether or not this was a good deal. However, Heifer nodded her head after she thought about Jason's words for a moment as she said with a faint smile, "If you return me perfectly purified ingots of the Evaldronite and Afinir ore, you won't have to pay anything, it's more likely that I'll have to pay up." Jason was glad to hear that as he thought, "They're just grade 3 ores, it will be fine I hope." Several hours flew by and Jason couldn't help but smile brightly as he looked at Solaris. Both his and Solaris stigmas were glowing brightly as the black flame spread through the first Evaldronite. After Shane had accepted the price for 10 unconditional favors if Jason were to be unable to perfectly purify all ores that were currently laid out in front of him, they had entered the basement of the antiquary shop. One could see a large room with Heifer's smithy placed in the center, and even without his mana eyes activated, Jason could tell that Shane's smithy paled in comparison to Heifer's. Only a short while later, they had already started to prepare everything necessary. While Dahlia left him to enter a different room in which she could take out her alchemy tools in order to concoct the most suitable and best inscription solution she was capable of concocting. Inscribing the right runes into a soul weapon was even more important than doing the same with mana weapons. In the end, a soul weapon was connected to one's soul and faulty runes inscribed on something that belonged to oneself as an entity was not something anyone wanted to face. As such, the right inscription serum was the first step to do everything properly. Emily left with Dahlia and only Shane, Heifer and Jason remained. However, Shane and Jason didn't even notice Heifer, who observed them keenly, because they were fully focused on their task at hand. While Shane began with the reduction process of the ores, Jason would purify the reduced ores before he would shape them into bars. After that was done, it would be Shane's task to create an alloy out of the two ingots, shape the weapon, and inscribe the runes that were able to take the forged weapon's highest potential into them. Once that was done, he had to cool it down, take care of the weapon with different surface treatments and finish the whole forging process by sharpening the blade. Meanwhile, Jason had to supply all three ingredients they used to forge the soul weapon with his soul imprint. At the same time, they should already be connected to him from the beginning. This meant that Jason had to loosen a soul thread during the purification process in order to allow the purified ingot to become acquaintances with his soul imprint. At the same time, Jason had already supplied the Mayrad soul wood with his soul imprint and soul thread since they had started. One could say that this was one of the most important steps. The handle that would be made out of the Mayrad soul wood was to become his connection to the rest of the weapon. As such, it had to have the firmest connection with him. In the end, several hours had already passed before Jason had even started with the purification process of the ores. Shane's preparations and the fact that he wanted to reduce all ores before Jason started with the purification process took so long. Meanwhile, the Mayrad soul wood had already begun to glow faintly, indicating that the connection between it and Jason was about to be established. If Jason were to pay attention to the Mayrad soul wood closely, he would have been able to see the infinitesimal golden and silver threads within the faint glow. However, his entire focus was on Solaris and the reduced Evaldronite ore he had already purified halfway through. In one way, it was not as difficult as Jason had expected it to be, but just when he thought about that, the soul imprint he had inserted into the Evaldronite ore was rejected. It looked like the ore was alive and Jason's eyes widened when he inserted more mana into his mana eyes to figure out what was going on. Huh. What is that? Chapter 414 Don't Even Ask by Hydesgrain. Jason couldn't tell if the things he perceived within the Evaldronite ore should happen or if it was something out of the ordinary, but the paper-thin mana threads he had already cleansed from all purities began to push away his soul imprint. This was weird and Jason had to focus on sustaining the soul thread he was controlling to maintain the soul imprint. At the same time, he had to take care of Solaris, the purification process, and that the impurities wouldn't injure anything else. Suddenly, the stigma on Solaris' mana core and above his right eye began to fluctuate as Jason's Celestia aura began to envelop the soul threads firmly. The Celestia aura forced its way through the Evaldronite ore inside the soul imprint which it enveloped. After splitting up a small part of its aura, it had been retraced by Jason, who was astonished about the sudden behavior his aura showed. However, after that, a small part of his Celestia aura remained on his soul imprint. Jason could tell that the Evaldronite ore submitted to him. It had stopped trying to push away the soul imprint, and instead, it began to approach the soul imprint carefully, trying to stay around it. This was something Jason didn't expect, but he had already been aware of the fact that his aura could be intimidating, and that was before he had undergone the primal Celestia bloodline awakening. As such, he figured out that he could try doing the same with the Mayrad soul wood he tried to force into submission with his soul imprint for the last few hours. He had already nurtured it a little bit and it had begun to accept him slowly, but from what Jason estimated, the time required to control it perfectly wouldn't be short and take at least several days, if not more. This was way too long, and instead of hesitating what to do, Jason told Solaris to halt in its tracks for a moment as Jason averted his attention from the ore that was placed right in front of him to the Mayrad soul wood. Focusing on his aura, thick sweat pearls poured down his back as released it towards the small, black-colored piece of wood in front of him. After he had targeted it with his aura, Jason forced his way through the wood until he was in its center where he had left his soul imprint that was faint and almost not visible. Jason split up a small part of his aura in order to leave it within the soul imprint that turned more vibrant with a faint luster around it. Nice. He was glad that it seemed to have worked out, and instead of several days, the submission process would take a few hours at most. As such, he had more than enough time left to perfectly purify every reduced ore that laid in front of him. Let's finish what I need first before purifying the remaining 2 lumps as a payment. When he told this to himself, Jason's motivation arose, which was noticeable as his aura had been fully unleashed. Jason was unaware of this, but the small smithy he was working inside was filled with a faint golden and silver mixed luster which his aura was radiating. At the same time, the ores in front of Jason seemed to scream, willing to be purified and used by him. When Jason felt their mana fluctuations, which he compared to the desire to be purified and used, he was unable to help himself as he smiled brightly. He didn't waste more time to think about what exactly was going on, and there was no time for him to wonder what Shane or Heifer were thinking about the weird behavior all ores unfolded. Both Shane and Heifer were currently dumbfounded, looking at Jason as if he was some sort of monster as Shane noticed that Heifer was about to approach. However, he could only show a confused expression showing how he felt inwardly. "Don't even ask me. I don't know what's going on. He already told you that his bloodline awakening occurred just a few days ago." Heifer didn't seem to accept this and felt the need to ask him, only to notice that she had bit her lips with too much force. She had just wanted to calm herself down by biting her lips, however, it looked like it made everything worse as her mind went riot. He is only 16 years old, how can Jason perfectly purify superior grade 3 ores without issues? It looks like the only problem he has to face is the issue about demonstrating the purified ore that the soul imprint is at the upper hand. Do his capabilities originate from the fact that he is a halfling from a foreign race, or is it really true that grade 3 materials are worse than we expected them to be? If we were to compare the cultivation system Jason told me about, grade 3 materials would be on par with the Peaklick, or lowest Prisma stage. The Prisma stage was the third stage in the foreign race's cultivation system, and Jason had already told them that the first 3 stages were seen as some sort of foundation in order to enter the 4th stage, that was called Ascension stage, where one would merge one's soul with the mana core. Other than that, even Jason didn't know what stages there might exist. However, he had already told the others, and Heifer, that there was a high possibility that several more stages existed. If mankind was already able to enter the low Prisma stage after less than 4 centuries, how strong were other races? With that in mind, Heifer couldn't help but think that Jason, who had undergone the bloodline awakening, shouldn't have many problems to become stronger. Why does that annoy me so much? She wondered, only to see both joy and jealousy glimmering in Shane's eyes. This told her that he must feel even worse than she was currently doing. Jason's entire being was enveloped in a thick aura brightening up the whole room as he gazed at the Avenir ingot he had perfectly purified before he extinguished Solaris flame. Several hours had passed and his task was finally over. Retracing the aura he had released during the whole purification process, he felt that the remaining strength that had been within him was suddenly drained. Stumbling backward, he could barely hold himself at the table that stood behind him. Wiping away the sweat that had formed on his forehead, Jason couldn't help but think that he did a very good job as he turned to Shane, who had already calmed down. "Good job, let me do the rest," Shane said while approaching him. "You can rest now, just continue to infuse your soul threats within the Evaldranite and Avenir ingot while I merge them to a Evaldrana alloy. Other than that, you'll have to pay attention to the Mayrid soul wood too." Jason smiled lightly when he heard what exactly Shane understood by resting, while saying that he had to pay attention to 3 things at once. Fortunately, that was not very difficult anymore because his aura lingered within all 3 materials' soul imprints, which passively attracted the soul treads he had released. As such, Jason couldn't help but close his eyes for a few minutes. Too many things had happened and he had yet to find time to release the tension in his body that had undergone too many changes during the last few months. He felt exhausted and couldn't move anymore as he slumped on the chair he had barely taken out of his spatial ring. Just like that, the glow around his stigma faded away. Left behind was only a mark that looked similar to a white-colored reversed wing with faint silver and golden-colored strands within. Heifer, who noticed this, thought that the stigma looked like a unique tattoo and nothing special at all. However, what astonished her more was the fact that Jason's aura had vanished too. It was as if he changed from the working state to a state where he could rest without the need to utilize everything, and the only task Jason's body actively did was to control the soul threads he released. He might be unable to sleep while doing so, but he could rest, which was enough for him at the moment. Unfortunately, he heard Heifer approaching him and knew that his short rest had already ended. Yet, instead of saying much, she just told him what she was currently seeing and perceiving. Under normal circumstances, she wouldn't do so, but Jason had told her that he was unable to control anything about the celestial bloodline he had inherited. Jason had already been astonished about the fact that he was able to control what his aura should do, which helped him quite a lot during the aura's purification process. As such, when he heard what Heifer told him, Jason was confused for a moment before he thought about what had changed compared to before. Chapter 415 Byakur by Hydesgrain. The most obvious change Jason perceived was his exhaustion. This was only obvious, and from the way he was currently feeling, his body could be compared to a machine that worked on power-saving mode. So, how can I decide whether I want to work at full speed or in the power-saving mode right now? He asked himself, with the desire to move. However, even after he had heard what Heifer said and that he asked himself how everything worked, Jason was unable to overcome his exhaustion. While sustaining everything necessary with his soul threads, a few more hours flew by before Jason was unable to stay awake anymore. Several months had passed without Jason being able to sleep properly, and the metamorphosis he had undergone had drained him from all energy that was left within him. Yet, he had forced himself to stay awake, to not rest for a single moment, only to find a secure location where nobody would be able to find and hunt them. Whether it were foreign races or other humans, Jason was not sure if he was seen as a threat from both sides or not. Even if he was not seen as a threat, he was aware of the fact that Argos was currently filled with war and chaos. Everything could happen, and Jason had wanted to rest once they had found a tranquil place. Unfortunately, this plan was interrupted by Shane's determination to start forging his soul weapon before he had found time to rest. As such, Jason, who had already been exhausted, used every ounce of energy and mana he had left within in order to perfectly purify each of the ores that had been in front of him. During that time he had exceeded his limits, which strained his whole body that had to rest now. He was not sure how much time had passed, but Jason was suddenly laying inside a large, soft bed. The fatigue on his body had been washed away, and Jason felt as if he had been reborn, and the only was his upper body that was weighed down by something. Right when he was about to get out of the bed, he noticed that Scorpio stared at him from the bottom of the bed, while Solaris floated above him. Meanwhile, Artemis and Petri laid inside the bed. The 3-meter-long snake used up most of the space within the bed, while Artemis tried to push him away without making too much of a commotion. When Jason saw all of that, he began to ask himself whether he was in a circus or not. It was a funny sight to see how his 4 soul bonds interacted with each other, but the remaining space he had left on the bed was not much. This became even more apparent when his soul bonds noticed that he was awake as they approached him, the closer the better. Because he couldn't cope with this obsessive attitude of his soul bonds right now, Jason used his stigma and soul world in unison to make himself some space. A moment after he utilized his stigma with the soul world in unison, his soul bonds disappeared as they emerged within the soul world. This was an extremely useful way in order to summon and return his soul bonds within the shortest interval. Yet, instead of feeling happy, Jason tried to get the hang of his stigma as he concentrated on it. Deactivate yourself. He lamented inwardly. However, nothing seemed to have changed, and Jason could only sigh. His mood was neither extremely good nor bad right now because he was wondering about too many things at once. Where are my masters? What happened to the soul weapon Master has forged? How can I control my bloodline? What should be our next step? Is there a plan, or should we prepare one? While he thought about everything possible, Jason changed his clothes that had been drenched in sweat before he walked outside the room he had been inside. He was still not sure where exactly he was, but with his mana eyes, Jason found his masters, Emily and Heifer, without further ado. They were downstairs, inside the backyard of the large mansion he was currently inside. Jason thought that it was Heifer's mansion, which would explain the expensive materials with which the mansion had been built. At the same time, he was already aware of the fact that Heifer had 5 solidified prismarine crystals within her mana core. This meant that she was the strongest, or rather highest-ranked human he had encountered until now. While he walked downstairs, Jason tried to experiment with his aura that seemed to have changed a lot since he had fallen asleep. Instead of feeling like something that didn't belong to his body, the aura enveloping him was now freely controllable. At the same time, Jason could tell now that the aura seemed to belong to him now. It was as if the aura had been remains of the wild Celestia bloodline that didn't want to accept Jason's human bloodline, only to be tamed after being strained to the limits during the purification process of the Evaldronite and Afinir ores. Now that he was able to retract the aura completely, one huge problem turned out to be easily solved. As such, there was only the small issue with the glowing stigma he had yet to solve. However, Jason was confident in his own capabilities, and a few days should be more than enough to solve this issue too. He had almost reached the backyard where everyone was when he realized that his soul bonds tried to gain his attention for quite some time. They were lamenting about something, and Jason didn't understand what they were trying to tell him. That was until his consciousness had entered the soul world. Right in the center of his soul world, Jason was able to see a sword that seemed to be a mixture between a scimitar and a broad longsword. It was rotating around its own axis as if it wanted to show everyone that it was perfect from every possible angle. Subconsciously, Jason's consciousness had already emerged in front of the long scimitar that had one thin, razor-sharp edge. The handle was 20 centimeters in length, black in color, which had to originate from the Mayrid Soulwood's color, and multiple tiny, black-colored runes had been engraved on it. The one-edged blade was also black in color, with silver-colored strands that looked similar to mana veins, spreading through the whole blade. It was around 85 centimeters long and had 2 large silver-colored runes inscribed on it, with several hundred small runes connecting to each other, building one large rune with 2 center points. Both center points were the exact position Jason's soul imprints were situated. The fact that both large and complex runes were inscribed at this position indicated that most mana veins were located in this area. Jason wanted to grasp the long scimitar with his hands, which forced him to leave the soul word. With his consciousness, he could touch anything, thus he summoned the long scimitar, which was the soul weapon Shane had forged for him. When the black-colored scimitar had been taken out of the soul world, it released strong mana currents, and the moment Jason's hand came in touch with it, he knew that it was extremely powerful. Holding it in front of himself, he could tell that it was perfectly balanced, while the slightly curved blade was perfectly suited for his fighting style. At the same time, the weapon weighed only 5 kilograms, which was extremely light, compared to most weapons forged out of ores within the rifts. However, this light weight didn't mean that it was weaker or less durable than other weapons. Rather than that, Jason was confident in its ability to cut through most Grade 2 weapons without any issues. If he had enough mana, the long scimitar should even be able to demolish all kinds of Grade 3 weapons. In the end, Jason was unable to see the soul weapon's limitations, and swinging it around, he could tell that it was not a mere weapon to slaughter but an extension to his arm, something that belonged to himself. It was as if he and the scimitar were one entity. Jason was not sure why Shane forged a long scimitar for him, but he found that it was the perfect weapon for him. There was nothing better than the soul weapon he had in his hand. While he was swinging the scimitar, as a sudden thought, that did not belong to him, emerged in his mind. Viacore. He was unable to tell what this word meant, but the moment he left the mansion to enter the backyard, the thought resurfaced in his mind again, which caused him to mumble it. Viacore. At that moment, he mumbled this word, all several hundred runes inscribed on the long scimitar began to erupt at once, releasing a certain emotion, shocking Jason and the others, who noticed that he woke up some time ago. Joy. Looking at the sword that released pure joy, Jason couldn't help but ask, "Are you Byakuya?" At the same time, Jason thought was transmitted to the scimitar. He could feel someone else's joy spreading through his body. With this, Jason was able to tell that the long scimitar's name was Byakuya, and the fact that his soul weapon was like a sentient being after it had been perfectly purified and imprinted with a minuscule part of his soul. Chapter 416 Tell Me What You Need by Hydesgrain. He was not sure if becoming sentient was something common for soul weapons, but Jason noticed that Byakuya could barely transmit emotions and not think actively. There had only been one transmitted word, which was its name. Other than that, Jason could only feel its joy, which slowly substituted, replaced by emptiness. Weird. He could only think, unsure whether his assumption about Byakuya being a sentient soul weapon or not. Maybe, it was a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence because it had awoken. Because he was unable to tell what was going with his soul weapon, Jason could only look at his masters and Heifer who were looking at him. "You're awake," Dahlia said with a faint smile as Heifer jumped up from the chair she sat on. "Did the soul weapon just release joy?" she asked without waiting for Jason to speak up, as she had already appeared in front of him. Taking a look at Byakuya, she could only scratch the back of her head. "No, that's not it." She had hoped that Jason's soul weapon had awoken sentience, but that didn't seem to be the case. Pseudo-sentience, or is it something like artificial intelligence? No, that doesn't make sense either. Heifer was aware of the fact that imprinting inanimate materials and objects with one's soul was as if one would split a minuscule part of it. This part would be transplanted into the desired object, and as long as it didn't repulse the soul imprint, it would gain something out of it. Those gains were in most cases a firmer connection with both the wielder and the weapon, or that the soul imprint allowed a weapon to act by itself for a short moment. However, there hadn't been something like sentience awakening caused by a soul imprint yet. The most, there were certain abilities a soul weapon would attain after binding with one's soul. "Can I test something?" Heifer asked before asking if Jason could hand over his weapon for a short moment. Not sure what Heifer wanted to test out, he nodded his head as he was about to hand her Byakuya. Yet, what Jason did not expect to happen, was that Byakuya tried to push away Heifer with faint mana currents it suddenly released. It was as if it wanted to stay with Jason and nobody else. Heifer expected that because this repulsive behavior of soul weapons was not an unique characteristic. Trying to insert her mana into Byakuya, she noticed that it was not possible, which was also to be expected. All of that was not worth being surprised about, and she took a look at the runes that were still activated, trying to find a connection between them and the weird sensation she had received from the scimitar a moment earlier. Heifer handed Byakuya back to Jason, who tried to insert mana into it in order to get to know his new weapon. It was something completely different from what he had used before. From daggers that were his first weapons, he had switched to a thin, light, longsword, and now he had a broad longsword, scimitar mixture of a weapon in front of him. Byakuya was still light, but other than that his new weapon was completely different in comparison to his other weapons. Those differences were advantageous, and if Jason had to say one disadvantage about Byakuya, it would be its length. However, just when Jason thought about that, he noticed that the amount of mana he was supplying to Byakuya intensified as it demanded more than it did in the beginning. Only a moment later, one of the large runes and the 3 soul imprints that originated from the 3 raw materials he had imprinted, began to glow faintly. The rune had been manifested, and Jason noticed that Byakuya's size was decreasing. This astonished him greatly, and he couldn't even hear what the others around him were saying, as his complete focus was on Byakuya and the fact that he had no idea what he was currently doing. Just as he thought that the weapon should have the same size as his daggers, Jason perceived that Byakuya's size changed within a moment. It had used up a large margin of mana that Jason had injected into it, but that was not a problem. Instead, Jason smiled brightly as he saw that his soul weapon had such a unique ability before he noticed that Heifer had already gone back to his masters. They didn't seem to care much about his soul weapon's ability, which Jason found weird as it was a huge contrast to Heifer's behavior when Byakuya released its joy. Is it normal for high-grade soul weapons to have abilities like that? He asked himself, only for Shane to clear his doubts. From your expression, I can tell that you're confused right now. The ability to adjust its size had been manually added. You can see the manifested rune in the center of the weapon. It was a little bit frustrating to inscribe this rune while combining them with all those other runes, but its effect is great, isn't it? Jason could only nod his head, not sure why he had never heard of such a rune. He had become too confident in himself after being able to perfectly purify grade 3 ores, only to find out that his knowledge has yet to catch up with his forging ability. Yet, when he thought about that, this was also not necessarily the truth. The only task he was able to accomplish at a high degree was purifying ores, and this was something he would have been unable to do without his Mana Eyes and Solaris. As such, without unique factors, his blacksmithing skill might be superb but not as great as everyone estimated him to be. Just at that moment, Jason heard that Heifer had been talking to him as he understood her last words. That's because of the perfect purified ingots you've returned as payment. As such, I'm in your debt instead of the other way around. If I were to forge a weapon with the Evaldronite and the Fenrir ingots you purified, I should be able to create something extremely powerful, maybe even a grade 4 weapon. It will definitely not be as well as your soul weapon, but still more than enough to make a huge profit. That is if I were to desire wealth. I'm in your debt. Tell me what you need and I'll give it to you. Jason didn't expect to hear something like that and could only look at Heifer in confusion as he remembered the other ingots he had perfectly refined too. I can request something from her. But what do I need right now? Jason was sure what he needed right now, however, it was not like Heifer could give him time. Time was something Jason required a lot. He wanted to improve his strength after all. Other than that, he had everything he needed. After his bloodline awakening, Jason was sure that he would need a new weapon, as the pseudo-mana grade 2 light longsword wouldn't be strong enough to cope with him for a long time. If he were to think about it, the pseudo-mana grade 2 weapon should be able to cope with him up to the mid-lick stage that was comparable to the late Grandmagus rank. Until he would reach this kind of combat prowess and mana to insert into a weapon, some time would have to pass. Yet, after he received a new weapon, Jason was sure that he would be able to use it until he had attained the mid-prisma stage. As such, he couldn't help but mumble. I just want to rest for one day before refining my physique. Suddenly he got an idea as he added. How about you give Shane and Dahlia something? I've never thanked them for taking me as their disciple, this could be considered a small gift. When Shane heard this he couldn't help but smile lightly, thinking that Jason was just unable to tell what he needed right now, while Dahlia smiled brightly. At the same time, it seemed like Heifer had an idea as she said. I will give both Shane and Dahlia one item they desire if you spar against me. It's not important whether you'll win against me after I've adjusted my strength. Your only task is to spar with me. Doesn't that sound nice? She wanted to find out multiple things by sparring with Jason, which included Jason's strength as a halfling, who had undergone a bloodline awakening. At the same time, Heifer wanted to see how powerful Jason's new weapon was. Jason would never decline a spar against an old one because he might be able to learn lots of things he was unaware of before. However, he couldn't help but think that he should be unable to control his aura during the sparring, which would mean that others might notice him. After he explained the problem he thought of, Heifer took out a small cube before saying, with this, you won't have to worry about anyone. With that being said, Jason accepted Heifer's request to fight. He had yet to find out how strong he was too. Chapter 417, Overdoing It. By Hydesgrain. Since he had awoken his bloodline, Jason had yet to find someone to spar with, and Heifer gave him the best possible way to do so. As such, he could hardly decline her offer, even if she were to give him nothing in return. Shane and Dahlia were only looking at the disciple, who had begun to smile brightly at the thought of fighting against Heifer. This caused them to frown a little bit as Emily blurted out, "He looks like a battle maniac." This seemed to be the case, and Jason's masters couldn't help but think that Jason was really similar to a battle maniac. Jason didn't hear what Emily said, but if he had heard her, it would be difficult to deny the bitter truth. He liked to fight others and compare his strength to them. Absorbing mana made him happy, and the sensation of becoming stronger was addicting. When Heifer heard that Jason accepted her proposal, she walked down the terrace before turning to the left, where a simple, yet large empty area could be seen. She placed the cube that was still in her hand on the ground before activating it. After that, a thin translucent membrane enveloped the empty space Heifer entered. Jason, who saw all of that, couldn't help but become interested in the cube. However, he was more expectant to spar against Heifer, and he followed her quickly. He wasn't wearing his combat clothes, but they could hardly protect him from attacks of a Prisma stage with 4 small, solidified prismarine crystals either way. As such, it was useless to think about wearing combat armor, and Jason went into a combat stance without thinking too much about the possible injuries he could sustain in this fight. They were currently in an isolated area, and Jason knew that he could give his all to fight against Heifer. Nevertheless, he didn't plan to unseal the race-specific weakening curse that nullified his soul world's amplification. With that in mind, he was currently fighting with his own capabilities without relying on his soulbond's strength to become stronger. Jason had been thinking about the fact that he could adjust the race-specific weakening curse his soul world core was harboring. This meant that he could attain a soul amplification between 0% as the lowest possible, or a soul amplification of 40%, which was what his soul world would share with him under normal circumstances. Initially, his soul world amplification was at 33%, but after he had undergone his primal bloodline awakening, it had increased to 40%. At least that was what he estimated his soul amplification to have increased to, as he was unable to tell precisely. My vessel won't have any problems with the mana core's size, but that's not the case with my physique. I have 2 physically attributed soul bonds, Scorpio and Petri, and I don't know how much my advanced vessel can take. With that in mind, Jason thought that it might be the best way to use the fact that he could unseal the curse on his soul amplification whenever he wanted to. Once he loosened the restriction on the curse that nullified his soul amplification, he would be able to increase his strength drastically. In combat stance, Jason waited for Heifer to initiate the start of the battle, which she did a moment later. However, instead of rushing forward, Heifer remained at the exact same position she was already standing without bothering about entering a defensive stance or anything like that. She won't restrict her strength, was the only thought in Jason's mind before he exerted the weightless steps technique as he rushed ahead. At the same time, he circulated mana through his body to enhance it overall, while inserting some of it into Bakor, increasing its sharpness and durability. Jason had yet to figure out which rune was responsible for what effect, only to see that Bakor was instinctively exerting every rune he wanted to utilize. Is that one perk of owning a soul weapon? He asked himself before he decided to postpone this thought for later. Right now he wanted to give his best to figure out how strong he had become. Only a moment after he rushed ahead, Jason had already crossed the short distance of 50 meters between him and Heifer as he slashed out at her. However, even before Bakor touched Heifer, Jason sensed danger approaching him, which caused him to halt abruptly. Jason didn't even continue the attack he had initiated as he jumped backward, only to see a whip, enveloped by electric currents shooting towards him. Gritting his teeth, he twisted his body, barely evading the whip that was about to hit him as he perceived that the attack was not over yet. The whip was moving freely, attacking him from all sides while Heifer was merely holding the handle of the whip, inserting mana into it. There was nothing else she did, only inserting mana with her affinity utilized inside the whip. She didn't even have to move an inch, and one could see a faint smile emerging on her lips. Jason was currently trying his best to evade the whip that was moving around like a snake until his mana eyes perceived something that could be helpful. While evading and deflecting the whip attacks that were around the low lick stage with around 90 drops of mana, Jason's strength reached a combat prowess of the lick stage with around 80 drops of mana. The difference was not much but enough to hinder Jason from attacking. Yet, she was using an affinity that was roughly at the lowest lick stage with fewer mana drops, while Jason didn't use anything except his physical strength and a little bit mana. This was already a good sign, and without wasting any more time he utilized several trumps he had up to his sleeves. First, he unleashed thick, compressed mist that enveloped the area around Jason a moment later. After that, Heifer would have been forced to pay attention to the mana fluctuations she perceived from him. This allowed Jason to tell that her full focus was on him. Only a moment later, he had already terminated the connection to the ice affinity which he had utilized for a quarter of a second. Rushing out of the mist, he used subtle movements to evade the following whip attacking as his eyes and Heifer's meet. At this moment, Jason noticed that it was his chance to counterattack. Using a majority of mana that was stored within his mana core to insert it into his mana eyes, he activates the Abyssal effect at the same time. Furthermore, he utilized Petri's Petrification Curse. His eyes harbored, thanks to his soul bond inheriting him the curse, for the first time since he had obtained them. Merging every means to attack Heifer mentally, Jason added his killing intent, which created a powerful attack that exceeded Jason's capabilities. It wasn't painful, but Jason noticed that using a large margin of mana to insert it into his eyes, utilizing the abyssal ability of his mana eyes, exerting the Petrification Curse, only to merge it into one attack with his killing intent was a little bit over the top. However, this was just the case for someone at the lower rank than he was. His opponent was a Prisma stage with 4 solidified prismarine crystals after all. As such, Jason was unable to hold back. What astonished him was that Heifer, who had been unmoving a moment before, had to take one step back as she accidentally released more mana into the whip than she had intended to do. She had been surprised by Jason's eyes that turned into something ancient, if not primordial, seemingly with the desire to devour her entire being. This surprise caused her to be unable to restrict her strength as she was already doing, and her whip's attack reached the strength and speed of a second-rank Grandmagus at around 200 drops of mana. It was fortunate that she had only been surprised for a short moment, otherwise, her attack's strength would have been much higher. Jason was already in front of Heifer after she had regained her composure after being surprised by him and about to slash at her when he sensed that the whip's pace increased by a large margin. It was easy to tell that he was unable to attack Heifer while evading the whip that was enveloped in electric currents. As such, he had to make a decision. However, instead of stopping his attack, Jason continued to advance at Heifer while he told Solaris to use both its own and his remaining mana to manifest a compressed fireball behind his back. Shooting out the fireball, it encountered the black whip a second later. It exploded, decreasing Heifer's control over the whip further as the mana it was suddenly enveloped with was burning. Meanwhile, the exploding fireball pushed Jason further ahead, increasing the impact Byakuya could execute as Heifer lifted her arm to deflect its attack. When Jason saw this, he couldn't help but think, "That's everything I can force out of her." Chapter 418 Well-deserved rest by Hydesgrain. Jason knew that he couldn't do anything against Heifer's high defense. But to see that she deflected the attack of the razor-sharp Byakuya that was additionally empowered with mana was frustrating. As such, while being pushed forward through the explosion that occurred behind him, Jason executed his entire force, only for his aura to erupt. Enveloping Byakuya, it began to glow lightly while the soul imprints began to shine brightly, activating the runes inscribed into the entire weapon. Normally Jason would have to insert more mana into the soul weapon to activate all runes, but it looked like his aura had finally turned from the Celestia aura he had before that of his own, a being forced to walk the path of someone from the human and the Celestia race. As his aura was fully unleashed, Heifer couldn't help but lift her eyebrows as she enveloped the arm she had lifted to block Jason's attack with a faint mana membrane. Byakur was enveloped tightly in a mixture of white, silver and a golden membrane. Nobody could tell what color was more vibrant, but all seemed to be important, visible at once, yet somehow not. However, this was still not enough to injure Heifer, who blocked everything with a small layer of mana enveloping arm. After that, the fight turned into a still stand as Jason noticed that the whip Heifer had controlled slowed down drastically as it touched Jason's back. He had thought that Solaris' mana nullifying ability would have been able to sever Heifer's connection to the whip she had used to attack him. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case, and it looked like he lost the sparring for good. However, the moment he retracted Byakur and Heifer retraced the mana around her arm, Jason could see a faint scratch. There was hardly visible, and the shallow scratch was not even deep enough to hope that it would start bleeding, but Jason was unable to suppress his joy as he shouted out, "Yes!" A moment earlier he had been extremely serious and ready to give his best to defeat Heifer, only to shout out in joy a moment later. This confused Heifer more than anyone else, who was already familiar with Jason's weird range of emotions. She followed Jason's gaze that was trained on her arm, and when she saw the faint scratch where Jason had hit her, Heifer couldn't help but say, "That's unexpected." Though, instead of being disappointed, she felt that Jason would already be considered extremely powerful if he were to be below 25 years old, let alone being 16 years old. Heifer was unable to suppress a smile as she saw how Jason, who could hardly control the sweat pouring down his temples, laughed out in joy. It's good that he can be happy in such perilous times. When she was at her age, there had yet to be the mana outbreak, but after the meteorite shower that came out of nowhere, exploded, creating thousands of temporary and permanent rifts, everything had changed. Now that she had lived for several centuries, she knew how hard it was to stay positive in times filled with war, and Heifer sincerely hoped that Jason would be able to stay like this. Nothing should happen to him or the people around him, because it would inevitably change everything about the way he acted right now. From what she understood, Jason was already aware of the dangers lurking around them, and he looked like he had already worked hard before the foreign races began to openly wage war. Clapping into her hands, she said, "Now both your masters can demand something from me. Anything and any time." Jason, who had been happy before, couldn't help but look at Heifer seriously for a moment before he smiled brightly as he thanked her. It was very beneficial to have 2 favors in total, and Jason couldn't help but hope that his masters would use their favor well. However, neither Shane nor Dahlia required anything right now. As such, they simply said that they would save the favor for later. Shane had already obtained everything he wanted from Heifer, which were the expensive items they required to forge Jason's soul weapon, while Dahlia was pondering about what she should ask for her favor. "I'm not sure what your plan for the next months is, but I think resting for some time might be good too. At least as long as it's still possible. Even if it might only be a few days, a few hours or a week, resting is very important for the body and one's mind." Heifer said this, recalling that Jason wanted to rest for at least one day. Everyone accepted this proposal because it was noticeable how worn out their small group was. Shane and Dahlia paid attention to everything around Emily and Jason when they were at the large mana vein, and at the same time, they continued to forge and concoct many goods for future purposes. They had already prepared lots of things one might require for the war because they couldn't evade it forever. Meanwhile, Emily had never been so tired in her life, while the sheer mass of mana she had absorbed overwhelmed her. She was also 16 years old and had never learned many things because she was an orphan. As such, she had to overcome many obstacles others at her age didn't have to face anymore. With that in mind, she worked relentlessly, as hard as Jason, who didn't have any rest for more than a year. Within the Mythic Garden, he had undergone many obstacles, while his body had undergone lots of changes since then. A baptism, Petri's curse, and the fact that his Celestia bloodline had been unsealed to a certain degree were very taxing to his body and mind. Even if he worked hard, Jason was the last one to complain about resting for a few days. While resting, he could refine his physique after all. Jason didn't feel any pain while refining his body, which should happen under normal circumstances. However, thanks to the soothing flame Solaris had, refining his body turned into something he liked to do. With that in mind, they rested at Heifer's house for an entire month before they heard news about a foreign race that had suddenly decided to infiltrate the Chandra country. Other than the foreign race, there were humans that had transformed, and their bodies had transformed tremendously. They didn't look different than a foreign race anymore, and one wouldn't have been able to tell that they had been humans, if there was not the apparent fact that they had soul bonds. The humans that followed the foreign race called Ephrata had their body filled with crimson-colored marks that looked similar to Jason's stigma. However, the biggest difference was that those marks were not gleaming but shedding blood, indicating that the human body tried to repel the marks and everything that belonged to it. Nevertheless, these marks and the extraordinary flames of the humans that belonged to the Ephrata race had made them extremely strong. Their initial combat prowess was estimated to be at the lowest lick rank with more than 20 drops of mana liquefied. However, their strength was on par with someone at the lowest lick stage and less than 80 drops of mana. The mysterious race that had protected Chandra country's territory had revealed themselves to fight against the Ephrata race and Efree, which was the name some citizens gave the transformed humans, but the numerical disadvantage was too high. "It's time to leave," Jason thought, reluctant before he extinguished the stigma's glow, turning it into a mark that looked similar to a tattoo of a reversed wing. Instead of doing nothing, Jason could tell that he had become unable to rest for more than 3 days. He was restless and felt useless, while his desire to do something was increasing by the second. As such, he started to work hard after resting for 3 days, in which he had refined his physique too. 2 days later, Jason finished the infant phase of the Netherworld Fort technique, which allowed him to enter the first stage, which increased his physical strength by a large margin, comparable to the enhancement one would receive from 10 drops of liquefied mana. Other than that, Jason was able to liquefy 3 drops of mana that had golden and silver strands within them. His mana absorption rate was extraordinary since he had accepted his blood as a Celestia to a certain extent, and Jason could only lament about the low amount of mana Kanye had. If someone else were to hear this, they would probably beat him into a pulp or curse at him. Yet, Jason couldn't help but think that liquefying 3 drops of his slightly more unique mana drops that were 3 times more compressed was nothing special. He had to become much stronger, as fast as possible, and the strength of a Grandmagus rank which he had attained was still not enough for him. Chapter 419, Joining War by Hydesgrain. It was obvious how dangerous the current times were, and Jason couldn't help but feel that he had to figure out more about those foreign races and the Efree. There was no way that the Ephrata was the only race that targeted the Chandra country, otherwise, there had to be a good reason for this. As such, it was obvious how important it was to acquire more information. While his strength had advanced, the same applied to his soul bonds that had become much stronger. The sole exception was Solaris, because Jason restricted its growth by not supplying any soul energy to it. His current soul energy had already reached more than 200,000 units, but Jason was still not happy about that. As such, if it was not necessary, Jason would refrain from nurturing Solaris for the time being. Meanwhile, Jason couldn't tell how many soul energy units Byakuya annexed, because the way the soul weapon occupied his soul energy units was completely different than his soul bonds did. While Jason perceived a connection between annexed soul energy and the soul bond that annexed it, this was not the case with Byakuya, who seemed to annex soul energy, yet somehow, not. It was not a major problem, but Jason found it odd, and it was always better to be prepared for every scenario, otherwise, he might run into trouble before he knew it. Being prepared was always good, which was another reason for him to not nurture Solaris with the vacant soul energy units he had accumulated. Jason was currently standing inside the backyard practicing the Devious Swordmaster martial art technique, and he couldn't help but reveal a confident smile. The Tier 2 martial art technique reached the familiar mastery and broke into the experience mastery within a single month. This showed how much of an advantage his advanced bloodline, refined brain and a perfectly compatible sword had in order to increase one's comprehension. It wouldn't be long before he would be able to reach profound mastery if his pace remained the same. Less than 24 hours had passed since Shane had told everyone about the news of the Ephrata race infiltrating the Chandra country, and the final preparations were concluded. Emily was the weakest member of the group, and her mana core rank was barely at the 6th master rank. This was already a great achievement for someone who has yet to turn 17 years old. However, she had absorbed mana next to a large mana vein for almost 8 months. If she was not even able to reach the 6th master rank in such a long time under such a great environment, she could have just given up on herself. Nevertheless, even if Emily was the weakest, the lesser Typhoon Rock had finally liquefied 30 drops of mana. This meant that the combined strength would be enough to fight against most lowest lick stage beasts, though she should evade foreign races and most transformed humans if possible. Transformed human was a new term used by most common humans when they saw someone whose appearance is different to theirs. It was created when the first few humans that looked different appeared next to the foreign races. There were many humans that had been lured to the foreign races' sides, and almost every single one of them had reached a much higher combat prowess than they previously had. Transforming brought them many benefits, and even if they knew that their body couldn't take the metamorphosis, or serum that had been injected into them, most of them were confident that their body would be able to assimilate to the substance soon. When Jason and the others departed, leaving behind Heifer, who said that she had to do something, it didn't take them long before they encountered the first small group of Ephrata and Ephree. They were traveling at a high altitude without using Shane's spatial affinity, because foreign races with a higher combat prowess might be able to detect Shane's mana fluctuation and pursue them. However, Jason doubted that it was safer to fly through the air because Shane was using mana to run through the air. He was one of the few people who didn't want to tame a flying beast, thinking that it was useless, while Dahlia was in a similar situation, only that she had been unable to bind many soul bonds. At the same time, her possibilities were restricted due to the affinities she had awoken. Only Jason and Emily had flying beasts. However, there was still the difference that Jason was using his fortified soul conjunction with Artemis to fly, while Emily had to sit on the 10-meter-long lesser Typhoon Rock. The first thing Shane had wanted to do when he saw the first group of Ephrata and Ephree was to attack and kill them, only to be held back by Dahlia and Jason at the same time. Dahlia thought that it was not wise to reveal his mana fluctuation and killing intent to obvious. A stronger Ephraitas might be nearby, and Jason's mana eyes, which he had consistently supplied with mana, could suddenly perceive lots of mana fluctuations further in the back. There seemed to be a battlefield, and the Ephrata and Ephree seemed to be on their way towards the battlefield in order to act as reinforcement. Unfortunately, they had to encounter Jason, his masters, and Emily before. There is a battlefield ahead. I'll take care of the Ephraitas and Ephree here. You guys can already go ahead and take a look. There should a few at the late lick stage, but the strongest mana fluctuations I perceived were at the peak lick stage, and nobody should have consolidated a prismarine crystal yet. Smiling lightly, he turned towards the Ephrata, and Jason couldn't tell why, but Solaris had begun to act weirdly. He was not sure what was going on, but it had definitely something to do with the Ephraya. At least that was what he comprehended after seeing the flames enveloping the transformed humans. The flames were completely different from normal fire affinities, yet also different from origin flames, and Jason couldn't help but feel that he had to investigate it further. Shane noticed that something pricked Jason's interest, but instead of saying anything he just nodded his head. Jason became much stronger throughout the last 2 years they knew each other, and it was obvious that he was able to take care of himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to survive venturing into 2 rifts that would have killed everyone at Jason's mana core rank. Dahlia left Jason only reluctantly, but after she sensed the mana fluctuations of the Ephraitas and Ivris that were almost a distance of 1 kilometer away from them, she nodded her head. Be careful and don't lower your guard. Some of them were once humans, but remember one thing. They won't hesitate a single moment to kill you too. Jason nodded his head, while Emily didn't say anything. She was scared that he had to enter war. At the age of almost 17 years, with a puny strength that had yet to reach the standards of an average Magus rank. What was she even doing right now? Approaching a battlefield of foreign races and humans that had liquefied their mana, manifesting attacks that destroyed their surrounding landscape. Good idea. She was only able to stay confident because Shane and Dahlia were next to her, while Jason was much stronger than one could think. Staring towards the Ephrata and Efree, Jason couldn't help but take a deep breath before he pressed Artemis' wings on his back, adjusting his angle to dive towards his first life and death battle against a foreign race and humans. Chapter 420, Demonstrating Real Power. By Hydesgrain. While he approached the small group of Ephrata and Efree, Jason scanned through their mana cores in order to detect the rough number of liquefied drops of mana they had. At the same time, he estimated how much their physique had been enhanced, as it should have a similar enhancement according to his opponent's mana core's size. Summoning Byakur within a single thought, he had already emerged above the lowest ranked Efree that had around 10 drops of mana liquefied within his mana core. As such, his first opponent was not a threat to Jason, whose strength had already reached the low lick stage with a physique comparable to 120 drops of mana. After he had added Artemis' amplification of 50% instead of 100%, which he received because she was currently within his mana core, Jason was much stronger than any of the Ephrata and Efree in front of him. They had noticed him the moment he had summoned Byakur, but it was already too late to save their comrade. Jason knew that he was about to kill a human as he slashed out with Byakur, which he had further sharpened by injecting mana into it. However, when he saw the Efree's face, Jason could tell that Dahlia's words were certainly true. If he didn't kill these monsters that could hardly be called humans, they would tear him apart without any hesitation. With a clean slash, Jason severed the head of his first opponent. His gaze followed the flying head, which caused him to look at it disgustingly for a moment. Throughout his entire life, he had killed hundreds if not a few thousand of beasts, but it was his first time to execute a human. Jason had expected that he would feel much worse than he was currently doing. He felt a little bit disgusted, but that feeling was quickly washed away as Solaris, who was in his soul world, shook wildly, telling him that he wants to be summoned. It was unknown exactly what the Black Origin flame wanted, but from the flames he had perceived around the Ivris, Jason could estimate what it desired. As such, he summoned Solaris into his hand before he threw it straight towards the severed body before he averted his attention to his other opponents. Solaris had subconsciously dragged him out of the disgust he had felt for a short moment. Because of that, he was able to think much clearer right now, and Jason had to thank Solaris once everything was done. From the resistance he sensed through his soul connection with Byakur, Jason was able to tell that the first opponent that had around 10 drops of mana was much stronger in his physical strength. At the same time, his mana eyes that perceived everything in his surroundings easily, identified that the flames lingering on and within the Efree were being nurtured by devouring life force. Is the Ephrata race using humans to nurture those flames and to fight for them? They're basically meat shields and food, completely unaware of it. When Jason noticed this, he couldn't help but eye the Ephrata race differently because they were much smarter than their appearance made him believe. They were humanoid like most races Jason had encountered until now, but their lower part was in a gaseous state. At the same time, their 2-meter-tall, bulky upper body was embedded with several dozen crimson-colored, glowing stigmas that looked similar yet extremely crude and useless to Jason. From what his mana eyes perceived, Jason could tell that the crimson-colored stigmas had been inscribed on the Ephrata's bodies, and they were a bad fake to a real stigma. The advancement their stigma transmitted to their mana circulation and affinity usage was insignificant compared to what Jason could unfold by using his stigma to the fullest. Even though it was useless, Jason couldn't help but think that the Ephrata race should feel what true power was. Yet, instead of showing it obviously, he barely hinted at his capabilities by utilizing his mana eyes' abyssal ability in addition to the petrification curse he harbored. his silver-golden colored eyes were enveloped in a halo of serpent pupils that began to glow brightly before everyone who had been staring at him had been paralyzed for a short moment. The lowest lick stage of free with less than 50 drops of liquefied mana within their cores even started to petrify slowly, shocking everyone around them. At the same time, Jason exerted the weightless steps technique to his fullest capabilities while retracting Artemis' wings. While he was doing so, he told Artemis to leave his mana core to allow Scorpio to enter his mana core. Manifesting Scorpio's sapphire-colored exoskeleton around him, he didn't forget about the 2-meter-long stinger that pierced out to the closest Ephrata to it. Jason knew that Scorpio's exoskeleton was not the best choice against the Ephrata and Freeze Flame that were much stronger than Scorpio because he had already reached his racial limit at 20 drops of liquefied mana. However, Jason didn't plan to defend against his opponents at all, as he had already appeared as his next victim. His speed had already accelerated by 60% and Jason continued to circulate mana through his body in order to increase his speed further. Before he knew it, the next 3 Ephraya and 2 Ephrata had been killed by Byakhor. With Byakhor, Jason didn't feel much resistance as long as he provided with enough mana. Jason noticed that he had taken away several lives within a few moments, but it didn't feel different compared to the beasts he had already killed. In the end, they were living beings too, and Jason had decided that it was time for them to die. Otherwise, others, his friends, masters, or even he himself had to die at their hands too. Jason had never felt that the rules of the jungle were that close to him, and he could tell that his opponents were aware of this too. They also noticed that Jason, who hadn't looked like someone extremely strong, massacred his way through their whole group that was strong enough to kill a human at the low lick stage with over 100 drops of liquefied mana. It was obvious that Jason would kill them all, but what wondered the Ephrata was the fact that the unknown being, that was able to summon wings and a sapphire-colored armor, had killed all former humans except one. They hadn't even been able to summon their soul bonds until now because the summoning process took too long. That was only the case without Fortified Soul Conjunction, or in Jason's case both the Fortified Soul Conjunction and the fact that his stigma allowed his soul bonds to be summoned without delay. The last Ifri that had survived Jason's onslaught until now, summoned his soul bond that was at the lowest lick stage with more than 80 drops of liquefied mana. It was a huge bear that was glad in flames that attacked Jason only reluctantly after being forced by its master. Jason didn't even bother about the bear because he had to evade several streams of turbulent flames that seemed to be alive. Those flames came from the weird, yet enhanced version of those flames the last Ifri and his death companions had. They were much stronger, and Jason could tell that his assumption about humans being used as a meat shield and a resource to nurture the flames he saw. On one side it was interesting, but on the other hand, it was disgusting, and the most ridiculous fact was that those flames were not even comparable to common origin flames. Even the E-grade origin flame, the president of the Artisan Tower, in Cryo City, was much better in comparison. It was hilarious to think that one had to nurture these weird flames in order to be worse than the worst possible origin flames. However, Jason couldn't tell how many of those flames existed and to what extent they could be nurtured. As such, it was possible for them to be even better than estimated. One was to think based on quantity instead of quality. Yet, Jason couldn't help but think that he might have to show them how a real flame looked like. With that in mind, Jason halted abruptly in his tracks, avoiding several fire whips at once before he turned towards the black origin flame. Solaris had already devoured the remains of the weird flame that had attracted it and was ready to return. It had devoured the weird flame, but this shouldn't have been that much of a surprise if Jason were to recall how the black origin flame had acted with origin flames. The Ephrata race's flames were somewhat similar, yet weaker than origin flames, and Jason estimated them to be beneficial for Solaris to devour and absorb. When he reached the range at which he could retract Solaris within his soul world again, he did so without hesitation before he switched out Scorpio, who was still within his mana core with Solaris. This forcefully disintegrated the sapphire-colored exoskeleton, only to be replaced by Solaris black flames that erupted within a single moment. Enveloped by those black flames, Jason's golden silver-colored eyes shone through them as if he was about to devour them entirely. The 5-meter-tall bear that was enveloped with flames stiffened, only to hear its master ordering it to continue attacking, which the bear was forced to do. However, before anything could happen, Jason activated his stigma while Solaris did the same. The black flames were pressed tightly against Jason's body, as the stigma glowed faintly through the thin layer of flames. His eyes were doing exactly the same, and Byakur, which he grasped tightly, began to release currents of killing intent before Jason charged ahead at the frightened Ifrita, Ifri, and his soul bond.